Welcome, dear listener, to another journey into the unglamorous corners of history. I hope this finds you well, wherever you might be listening from, perhaps settling into bed after a long day, or taking a quiet evening moment for yourself. Or maybe you're one of those delightful night owls who finds these long historical explorations the perfect companion for the small hours. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, thank you for choosing to spend the next few hours with me, wandering through the darker corridors of the Viking Age. Before we begin properly, a gentle reminder that if you find these deep historical dives valuable, whether as sleep aids, educational content, or simply as company during quiet hours, the subscribe button is there waiting for you. No pressure, of course. These videos will be here whether you subscribe or not, but it does help the channel continue producing these exhaustive examinations of history's less glamorous moments. And if you have thoughts, corrections, or suggestions for future topics, the comments are always open. I read them all, even if I can't respond to everyone. Now then, tonight's topic is one that popular culture has thoroughly misunderstood: Viking execution methods. You've probably encountered the myths, the blood eagle, elaborate torture rituals, savage Vikings inventing creative new ways to kill their enemies. Television shows and novels have given us theatrical violence, dramatic set pieces, executions as entertainment spectacle. And while these depictions make for compelling drama, they bear little resemblance to what actually happened when Viking Age Scandinavians executed criminals. The boring historical truth, and this is, after all, boring history, is that Viking executions were mostly just hanging. Simple, practical, unglamorous hanging from trees or wooden structures, occasionally beheading for higher status criminals, sometimes drowning in bogs, wells, or the ocean, rarely burning or more elaborate methods. But popular culture ignores these mundane realities because they don't fulfill our psychological need for Vikings to be uniquely brutal, theatrically violent, fundamentally different from us. So over the next several hours, we'll examine what archaeological evidence, saga literature, and legal codes actually reveal about how Vikings executed criminals. We'll look at the common methods everyone ignores, we'll explore the legal frameworks that governed capital punishment, we'll examine execution grounds, the role of executioners, the treatment of bodies after death. We'll address the myths directly. Yes, we'll talk about the blood eagle, and separate historical reality from modern fantasy. And we'll consider what our misunderstandings about Viking execution reveal about us rather than about them. Picture, if you will, a thing assembly ground in 10th century Iceland. The summer sun hangs low on the horizon, never quite setting during these bright months. Families have gathered from across the region for the annual assembly, the largest gathering of the year, combining legal proceedings with social opportunity. Among the tents and temporary booths, serious matters are being decided, and today one of those matters is an execution. Not a theatrical spectacle, not elaborate torture, but a legal proceeding that will end with a man hanging from a tree at the assembly grounds boundary. Witnesses will watch not from bloodlust, but from civic duty. And when it's done, life will continue, because this is simply how justice works in this time and place. Let us begin. When we speak of Viking executions, we're discussing capital punishment practices across a vast geographic and temporal range that popular culture tends to collapse into a single unified image. The Viking Age, conventionally dated from roughly 793 CE, with the Lindisfarne raid to 1066 CE, with the Battle of Stamford Bridge, spanned nearly 3 centuries. During this period, Norse culture extended from Iceland in the west to the Rus territories in the east, from Greenland's shores to the Mediterranean's northern coast. The execution practices we'll examine come from this entire span of time and space, unified by shared cultural and legal frameworks, but varying significantly in local application. Scandinavia itself comprised distinct regions with their own particular characteristics. Norway's mountainous terrain and fjord-carved coastline created isolated communities connected primarily by sea. Sweden's more open landscape allowed different patterns of settlement and political organisation. Denmark's flat, fertile lands supported denser populations and earlier centralised power structures. And Iceland, that remarkable experiment in republican government established by Norwegian emigrants in the 9th century, developed perhaps the most extensively documented legal system of any Viking Age society, giving us the invaluable Gregos law codes that preserve details about execution and other legal matters. The climate shaped everything. Scandinavian winters were long, dark, and potentially deadly. Summers provided brief, intense growing seasons and endless daylight. This environmental reality influenced execution timing. Winter executions meant bodies left exposed would freeze quickly. Summer meant faster decomposition. Bog drownings worked differently in winter when water surfaces froze. Ocean tide drownings were impossible in regions with minimal tidal range. Geography was never neutral backdrop, but active participant in how Vikings practiced capital punishment. The population structure also mattered. Viking Age Scandinavian society was stratified into rough categories. At the top, wealthy landowners and chieftains. In the middle, free farmers who owned their land and participated in thing assemblies. At the bottom, thralls, slaves who made up perhaps 10 to 20% of the population. This hierarchy profoundly shaped execution practices. Free men received legal protections and due process. Thralls could be executed casually by their owners with minimal oversight. The same crime could earn a fine for a wealthy man, and death for a poor one, and death for a slave who committed no crime at all beyond displeasing their owner. The timeline of Christianization adds another layer of complexity. Denmark converted relatively early, with Harald Bluetooth's famous conversion around 960 CE. Norway's conversion occurred gradually through the 10th and early 11th centuries, often violently under kings like Olaf Tryggvason. Sweden held out longer, with Uppsala remaining a pagan stronghold into the 12th century. Iceland converted in 1000 CE through a negotiated thing assembly decision. Remarkably, a democratic vote on religious belief. These varied conversion timelines meant that execution practices blended pagan and Christian elements differently across regions and time periods. Understanding this geographic and temporal complexity prevents us from imagining the Vikings as a monolithic culture with uniform practices. A 10th century Icelandic execution proceeding through thing, assembly decision differed from a 9th century Norwegian execution, ordered by a local chieftain. Christian-era Danish executions incorporated different theological frameworks than earlier pagan rituals. Yet beneath this diversity, shared cultural assumptions and legal traditions created recognisable patterns that allow us to speak meaningfully about Viking execution, while acknowledging regional and temporal variation. To understand Viking execution, we must first understand Viking conceptions of law, honour and social order. Unlike centralised medieval kingdoms with professional law enforcement and standing judicial systems, Viking Age Scandinavia operated on principles of communal law enforcement and reputation-based social control. There were no police, no lawyers in the modern sense, no jails for long-term imprisonment. Instead, elaborate legal codes specified compensation payments for various offences, and when compensation failed or crimes were too serious to be settled by payment, other remedies became necessary, including execution. The thing assembly served as the centre of legal life. These gatherings, some local, some regional, some encompassing entire territories, combined legislative, judicial and social functions. Free men, and in some rare cases free women of property, attended to settle disputes, hear law recitations, conduct trade, arrange marriages, and witnessed legal proceedings including executions. The thing transformed law from abstract principle into concrete communal practice, making justice visible and participatory rather than distant and professional. When someone was sentenced to death at a thing, the entire community bore witness and shared responsibility for the decision. Honour, that difficult to translate concept that pervades saga literature, shaped everything. A person's reputation determined their social standing, economic opportunities, legal credibility, and marriageability of their children. Honour could be gained through brave deeds, generous hospitality, skilled craft work, and honourable behaviour. It could be lost through cowardice, oath-breaking, failed obligations, or criminal acts. And once lost, honour was extraordinarily difficult to regain. Some crimes were considered so dishonourable that execution was almost merciful compared to the social death of living with destroyed reputation. This honour-based system helps explain certain execution practices that might otherwise seem strange. Why did some condemned people choose execution over outlawry? Because outlawry meant living without honour, dying slowly in the wilderness as a hunted animal, rather than facing death with whatever dignity execution could provide. Why did execution methods vary by social status? Because even in death, honour hierarchies had to be maintained. A free man's death by sword carried more honour than a slave's death by drowning. Why were bodies sometimes denied burial? Because even corpses carried honour or its absence, and denying proper burial extended dishonour beyond death. The legal concept of weregild, compensation payment for harm done, pervaded Viking law. Most offences could theoretically be settled through payment. Kill someone's son, and you owed his family a specified amount based on the victim's social status. Injure someone, and payment varied by wound location and severity. Steal property, and compensation was assessed. This system provided alternatives to blood feud and execution, allowing communities to maintain peace through financial settlement rather than escalating violence. But weregild only worked when both parties agreed to accept it. If the victim's family refused compensation, if the criminal couldn't pay, or if the crime was considered beyond compensation, like sorcery or repeated offences, execution became the alternative. The spiritual worldview of pre-Christian Vikings also shaped execution practices. They believed in an active spiritual world where the dead could return to trouble the living, where certain locations were spiritually dangerous, where contact with death created pollution that transferred to the living. These beliefs explain why executioners lived as social outcasts, why execution grounds occupied boundary spaces between settlement and wilderness, why executed criminals were buried face down or denied burial entirely. Death was not simply biological cessation, but spiritual transformation that required careful management to protect the living community. Christianity gradually overlaid new frameworks onto these pagan foundations without entirely replacing them. Christian Vikings worried about salvation and damnation, in addition to honour and reputation. Execution could now be framed as sending souls to divine judgment, rather than simply removing criminals from the community. But the practical mechanics of killing, the ropes, swords, drowning pools, remained largely unchanged. What shifted was meaning and interpretation more than methodology, as we'll explore in later chapters. Here, then, is what we'll be arguing over the next several hours. Viking execution was neither uniquely brutal nor theatrically creative, but rather a practical, legally regulated, socially embedded practice that served multiple functions beyond simply removing criminals from society. The myths of elaborate torture and innovative violence tell us more about modern psychology than historical reality. And by examining what Vikings actually did, the boring, mundane, legally codified practices revealed by archaeology and documented in law codes, we gain insight into a society that took law seriously, that developed sophisticated legal frameworks for managing violence, and that struggled with the same moral questions about capital punishment that persist today. This argument challenges popular culture's depiction of Vikings as savage barbarians who killed creatively and enthusiastically. Instead, we'll see that Viking Age Scandinavians used execution sparingly compared to many medieval societies, that they developed elaborate legal protections requiring communal decision-making before execution of free people, that their most common execution method was simple hanging rather than elaborate torture, and that archaeological evidence contradicts the sensationalized violence of saga literature and modern entertainment media. We'll examine how execution served multiple social functions simultaneously. Obviously, it removed criminals permanently from society, but it also reinforced community values by making consequences visible, distributed moral responsibility across all witnesses, maintained honour hierarchies even in death through differentiated execution methods, and created shared memories that bound communities together through collective participation in legal violence. Execution was never just about killing. It was about justice, honour, community cohesion, spiritual management and social control all at once. We'll also explore the surprising sophistication of Viking legal frameworks. The Thing assembly system provided checks on arbitrary execution. The possibility of compensation payment instead of death created off-ramps from violence. The legal distinction between different crimes and appropriate punishments showed careful thought about proportionality. Even the brutal aspects of Viking execution, the denial of burial, the social ostracism of executioners, the degrading treatment of corpses, served coherent purposes within their cultural logic, even when they disturb modern sensibilities. Most importantly, we'll confront our own relationship with historical violence. Why do we want Vikings to be more brutal than evidence suggests? What psychological needs do myths about blood eagles and elaborate torture fulfill? How does imagining past societies as uniquely violent allow us to avoid examining our own capacity for violence? The boring history of Viking execution, routine hanging, legal procedure, communal witness, makes them uncomfortably similar to us rather than reassuringly different. And that similarity may be precisely what makes us prefer the myths to the reality. Over the next 25 chapters, we'll build this argument through systematic examination of execution methods, legal frameworks, social contexts, and archaeological evidence. We'll move from the common and mundane toward the rare and unusual, from legal structure to practical implementation, from life to death to treatment of bodies after death. And by the end, I hope you'll see Viking execution not as exotic barbarism, but as a revealing example of how humans across all times and cultures have struggled to create systems of justice that balance social order against individual rights, community safety against moral cost of killing. So let us begin with the legal frameworks that governed Viking execution, the Thing assemblies where death sentences were pronounced, and the careful distinctions Viking law made between crimes that merited death and those that could be settled through other means. Chapter 1. The legal framework of Viking death penalties. When we think of Viking executions, we tend to imagine impulsive violence, a warrior's rage, a blood-soaked battlefield, the chaos of raiders dispensing rough justice at sword point. But this vision, as compelling as it may be, misses something far more unsettling about how Norse societies actually handled capital punishment. The Vikings, you see, had extensive legal codes. They held formal assemblies, they debated, they voted, and when they decided someone must die, they did so not in hot-blooded fury, but through cool, systematic legal process. Picture, if you will, a Thing assembly on a summer day in 10th century Iceland. The assembly site sits on an open plain, surrounded by temporary booths where families have travelled days to attend. Perhaps 2,000 people gather, the largest congregation of the year. At the centre, the law speaker recites from memory the legal codes governing their society. Among the assembled crowd, a man stands accused of murder. Witnesses speak. The accused defends himself. The free men of the assembly cast their judgment, and if the verdict is death, it comes not from a king's whim, but from communal legal consensus, codified in laws refined over generations. What made this truly disturbing was not the violence itself, but its systematic nature. The Icelandic Gragas law codes, compiled in the 12th century but reflecting earlier traditions, specified with bureaucratic precision which crimes merited execution: murder without payment of compensation, sorcery, persistent theft, certain sexual offences. Even more revealing, these codes distinguish between types of death sentences. Some criminals received utlaga, outlaw, status, which was in many ways worse than execution. An outlaw lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill them without penalty. They could own no property, receive no aid. They became legally non-existent, forced to flee to the wilderness, where they would slowly starve, freeze, or be hunted down like animals. The Raffenkel saga tells of a man named Eyvinder who chose execution over outlawry. When given the choice between immediate death or banishment into the harsh Icelandic interior where winter would surely claim him, he requested the sword. At least, he reasoned, death by execution allowed his body proper burial, his family to keep their honour intact. Outlawry meant dying alone, his corpse unburied, his name forever stained. The saga records that he faced his execution with composure, considering it the more merciful option. Imagine that calculus, choosing immediate death over uncertain survival, because legal death preserved something outlawry destroyed. It's hard not to feel a certain dissonance when confronting this reality. Our romanticised Vikings, those fierce warriors of popular imagination, had law books. They had legal procedures that would rival many medieval societies for complexity. The next time you see a television show depicting Vikings as anarchic barbarians dispensing arbitrary justice, remember Eyvinder choosing his death. Remember the law speaker reciting codes. Remember the thing assemblies voting on capital cases. The most unsettling aspect of Viking execution wasn't its brutality. Many cultures were brutal, but its orderliness, its reduction of death to legal process, its transformation of killing into civic duty performed according to established precedent and communal consensus. Chapter 2. Hanging, the common method. No one talks about. Here is what you need to understand about Viking executions. The most common method was also the most boring, not the blood eagle, not ritual sacrifice, not elaborate torture, just hanging. Simple, efficient, unglamorous hanging from trees or wooden structures, and this ordinariness, this mundane quality, is precisely why popular culture ignores it. We want Viking death to be theatrical, but archaeology and saga literature tell us it was usually just rope and branch and slow strangulation. Imagine a spring morning in 9th century Norway. A man has been convicted of repeated theft at the local thing assembly. The sentence is death by hanging. The community processes to a grove at the settlement's boundary, neither fully inside the village nor entirely outside it, but in that liminal space between civilization and wilderness. A sturdy oak tree serves the purpose. The condemned man's hands are bound behind his back. A rope, perhaps woven from hemp or made from twisted leather strips, is looped around his neck. No trapdoor, no calculated drop to break the neck cleanly. That's a much later innovation. Instead, he's simply hauled up by several men pulling the rope over a branch, his feet kicking uselessly at air, his body weight constricting the noose around his throat. The dark reality of Viking-era hanging was its slowness. Without the broken neck of a properly executed drop hanging, death came from strangulation. Arterial compression cutting blood to the brain, airway compression preventing breath. Consciousness might persist for 30 seconds, a minute, even longer if the knot placement was poor. The body's autonomic responses would continue for several minutes more. Convulsions, bladder and bowel release, the strange jerking movements that witnesses found disturbing enough to attribute to supernatural causes. And often, the body would remain hanging for days afterward, a warning to others, a legal declaration visible from a distance. The archaeological evidence confirms this practice with uncomfortable specificity. The Tollen man, discovered in a Danish bog in 1950, remains one of the most haunting examples. His face, preserved by the bog's chemistry for over 2,000 years, appears almost peaceful, eyes closed, lips pressed together in an expression that seems more contemplative than agonized. But around his neck, still in place, is the braided leather rope that killed him. Analysis of his body shows he died by hanging, probably as a criminal or ritual sacrifice in the early 4th century. His last meal was a gruel of barley and seeds. His hands and feet were soft, suggesting he was not a labourer. He was hanged, and his body placed in the bog with what appears to be deliberate care. So the next time someone mentions the Blood Eagle as the quintessential Viking execution, picture instead the Tollan man's peaceful face and leather noose. Remember that most Viking executions involved no elaborate ritual, no saga-worthy drama, just rope and gravity and the slow dimming of consciousness. The brutal truth is that Vikings killed their criminals the same way most pre-modern societies did, efficiently, cheaply, with materials at hand. The boring history of Viking execution is mostly just the history of hanging, repeated countless times across 3 centuries, leaving its evidence in saga fragments and bog-preserved bodies with rope marks still visible on 2,000-year-old skin. Chapter 3: Sacred Groves and Execution Grounds. The location of death mattered to the Vikings. Execution was not simply a practical matter of disposing of criminals, it was a spiritual act that required proper geographic context. And so they chose their execution sites with the same care they chose their burial grounds, their temples, their thing assembly locations. These were not random clearings in the forest, but deliberate meaningful spaces where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead became permeable. Picture one of these sites, perhaps the execution grove at Uppsala, described by Adam of Bremen in his 11th century chronicle. He wrote of a sacred grove near the great temple where trees served as permanent gallows. Bodies hung from branches, human and animal both, offered to the gods during the great sacrifices held every 9 years. Adam, writing as a Christian outsider, claimed to have seen the grove himself, though his exact reliability is debated. But his description matches other references to similar locations: sacred groves at settlement boundaries, crossroads where multiple paths met, islands in lakes, clearings marked by standing stones, places that were simultaneously natural and constructed, mundane and supernatural. What made these sites truly unsettling was their dual nature. An execution ground was spiritually dangerous. The violence that occurred there, sanctioned, legal violence, but violence nonetheless, polluted the location. The dead remained present in some sense, their spirits lingering in the boundary space between life and death. People who carried out executions became contaminated by contact with death, and the places where they worked absorbed that same pollution. Archaeological excavations of suspected execution sites show evidence of repeated use over centuries. The same clearings, the same groves, the same boundaries chosen again and again. At Gamla Uppsala in Sweden, researchers have identified a potential execution site used from the Viking Age through medieval times, its soil showing elevated phosphate levels consistent with decomposing bodies. The executioners themselves could not escape this spiritual contamination. Saga literature and later law codes make clear that those who carried out death sentences occupied a paradoxical social position. Their work was necessary and legally sanctioned, yet they were also considered polluted, dangerous, somehow tainted by their proximity to death. Many executioners lived apart from the main settlement, on its literal and social margins. Their children often inherited the role, creating dynasties of executioners who could not escape the stigma. One saga references an executioner who lived in a small hut on the far side of a stream from the village, crossing only when his services were required, paid in the dead man's clothes and possessions, the only compensation anyone would offer for such polluted work. We can scarcely imagine such a world, where violence is not just legal but spiritual consequences, where the ground itself can become dangerous through its use for execution. Modern executions happen in contained, neutral spaces, prison buildings, designated rooms, spaces that carry no spiritual freight. The Vikings executed people at the edge of the sacred and profane, in groves that served as bridges to the otherworld, and they understood that such acts left permanent marks on both the landscape and the people who inhabited it. Geography and theology intersected at the execution ground, transforming state violence into something simultaneously legal, spiritual, and geographically embedded in the very land. Chapter 4. The Blood Eagle. Separating myth from reality. Now we must address the execution method that has captured modern imagination above all others, the blood eagle. If you have heard anything about Viking executions, you have probably heard of this alleged practice, described in saga literature as the ultimate revenge killing reserved for the worst enemies. The victim's back would be cut open, the ribs severed from the spine and bent outward like wings, the lungs pulled through the opening to create a gruesome tableau. It appears in television shows, novels, video games, metal album covers. It has become the defining image of Viking brutality. And there is only one problem with this. It almost certainly never happened. Imagine the saga scene as described in the Orkney-Inga saga. Earl Einar of Orkney captures his enemy Halfdan Longlegs and declares he will kill him with the blood eagle to avenge his murdered father. The saga text describes the act with frustrating ambiguity. Einar cut a blood eagle on his back with a sword so that he severed all the ribs from the backbone down to the loins, and then pulled out the lungs. Similar references appear in a handful of other sagas, always for high-status victims, always as revenge for extreme offences. But here is what makes scholars sceptical: the anatomical impossibility and the linguistic ambiguity. The dark truth about the blood eagle is not that Vikings performed this elaborate torture, but that we want them to have done so. Modern anatomical analysis shows that the procedure as described would be nearly impossible to perform on a living victim. Severing ribs from the spine requires cutting through extremely tough connective tissue and thick muscle. The shock, blood loss, and trauma would kill the victim within seconds. The idea of pulling lungs through the opening while the person remained conscious long enough to experience their own torture, as some descriptions suggest, violates basic physiology. Medieval physician experiments in the 2000s with cadavers confirmed that even with modern tools, the procedure cannot be performed as the sagas describe while keeping the victim alive for any meaningful duration. More likely, scholars suggest the blood eagle was poetic language for a simpler act, a backstabbing or a post-mortem mutilation. Old Norse poetry used kennings and metaphors extensively. To cut an eagle might simply mean to kill with a blade between the shoulder blades. The description of spread ribs might be how a poet described a particularly deep back wound, not a literal anatomical procedure. The Heimskringla's description of King Ella's death by blood eagle might have been saga authors, embellishing a traditional backstabbing revenge killing with gruesome poetic details, never intending readers to take the description as literal medical procedure. It's hard not to reflect on what the blood eagle myth reveals about us rather than Vikings. We have taken a handful of ambiguous saga references and constructed an entire execution method from them. We have ignored the scholarly consensus, the anatomical impossibility, the linguistic ambiguity. We want Vikings to be brutally creative in their violence because it serves a narrative function. It makes them the ultimate barbarians, and by contrast makes our own society seem civilized. The next time you encounter the blood eagle in popular culture, remember that the real Viking executions were mostly just hanging and beheading and drowning. Boring, practical, unglamorous deaths. The blood eagle persists not as history but as cultural fantasy, revealing less about Viking Age Scandinavia than about our contemporary fascination with theatrical violence. Chapter 5. Drowning in wells and bogs. Water served the Vikings as both life-giver and executioner. And of all the water-based execution methods, none has left more archaeological evidence than drowning in bogs and wells. These wetland executions produce something unexpected: preservation. The same anaerobic acidic conditions that killed execution victims also preserved their bodies for centuries, giving modern researchers an intimate knowledge of deaths that occurred over 1,000 years ago. Picture a bog in Iron Age Denmark, a wet, acidic environment where sphagnum moss grows thick and the water stains brown with tannic acid. A person convicted of a serious crime is brought to this place at the community's edge. Their hands may be bound, they may be struck on the head first, or strangled, or have their throat cut, or all three in sequence, a ritual overkill that archaeologists find puzzling. Then they're pressed down into the soft, wet peat, perhaps with stones or wooden stakes to hold them beneath the surface. The cold water closes over their face. If they remained conscious through earlier injuries, this is where death finally comes. The slow suffocation of drowning, lungs filling with water, brain starving for oxygen, consciousness dimming in the cold and dark. What makes bog drownings truly haunting is what the bogs preserved. The Kehausen boy, discovered in 1922 in Germany, was perhaps 14 years old when he died. His body showed signs of intentional drowning, positioned face down in shallow bog water, held there until death occurred. His intestines were preserved enough to analyse his last meal, a simple grain porridge. His hands, soft and uncalloused, suggested he was not a labourer. Who was he? Why was he killed? The bog preserves the physical evidence of his death, but tells us nothing of his crime, his name, his final thoughts as the water rose over his young face. The archaeological evidence reveals patterns that make execution seem more likely than simple murder for many bog bodies. Multiple killing methods suggest ritual purpose. Why strangle, stab, and drown someone unless the act carried symbolic meaning? Careful body positioning in the bog indicates intentional placement rather than hasty disposal. Some victims' last meals contained unusual grain, mixtures found elsewhere only in ritual contexts. The Grauballe man, dated to the late 3rd century BCE, was killed by having his throat cut from ear to ear, a precise, efficient killing that severed both carotid arteries. His body was then placed naked in a peat cutting, where the bog's chemistry preserved his skin, his fingerprints, his internal organs with such fidelity that his discoverers in 1952 initially believed they had found a recent murder victim. So the next time you hear about Viking executions, remember the Kehausen boy pressed face down in cold bog water. Remember the Grauballe man's preserved hands and empty stomach. Remember the dozens of other bog bodies that speak to us across millennia with uncomfortable specificity. Water executions, drowning in bogs, wells, or later as we will see in the ocean, left a particular kind of evidence that makes these deaths more real, more individual, than almost any other historical execution method. The bog's preservation is both a scientific gift and an emotional burden, giving us intimate knowledge of deaths we might prefer to keep safely abstract and distant in time. Chapter 6. Beheading, Status and the Sword. Not all Viking executions were equal. The method of death signalled social status, and beheading with a sword represented something approaching honour, at least compared to the alternatives. This was death for free men convicted of serious crimes, not for slaves or the truly despised. It required a valuable weapon, a certain ceremony, and ideally, a skilled executioner who could deliver death in a single stroke. Ideally. But archaeology tells us that ideal executions were rarer than the sagas would have us believe. Imagine the execution ground on a grey morning in 10th century Denmark. The condemned man convicted of murder kneels before the assembled witnesses. He has been allowed to prepare himself, perhaps to speak final words. The executioner approaches with a sword, not his own weapon, which would be polluted by the act, but a blade designated for this purpose. The goal is to strike precisely at the junction between cervical vertebrae severing the spinal cord and major blood vessels in one clean blow. The man closes his eyes. The executioner raises the sword. And then, if the executioner lacks skill or the condemned man flinches at the wrong moment, the blade strikes bone. What made beheading particularly brutal in practice was how often it went wrong. Osteological analysis of execution victims from Viking Age burial sites reveals the uncomfortable truth. Multiple blade marks on cervical vertebrae show that executioners frequently required 2, 3, even 4 strikes to separate head from body. The mass execution burial at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, England, likely Viking raiders executed by Saxons around 1000 CE, shows particularly clear evidence. 54 young men, all decapitated, many with defensive wounds on their arms suggesting they saw the blade coming and tried instinctively to protect themselves. The vertebrae bear witness to the messy reality. Blade marks at odd angles, multiple strike attempts, bones partially severed requiring additional cuts. The saga literature occasionally acknowledges this ugly reality. In Egil's saga, a beheading is described where the executioner's first strike lands poorly, hitting the condemned man's shoulder instead of his neck. The second strike cuts through spine, but the man has already endured seconds of consciousness with a deep shoulder wound, knowing another blow is coming. This was not the clean, samurai movie decapitation of popular imagination. This was a heavy blade striking thick neck muscles, tough cartilage, dense bone, sometimes succeeding on first attempt, often not. Yet beheading still carried prestige relative to other methods. The victim typically remained clothed, faced death kneeling rather than suspended, received a weapon death rather than strangulation's ignominy. Their body, though mutilated, could receive proper burial. Some condemned men specifically requested beheading over hanging, considering it more honourable despite the risk of a botched execution requiring multiple strikes. The archaeological evidence from execution burials shows that beheaded victims were often buried with some care. Bodies arranged properly, sometimes with grave goods, in marked contrast to hanged criminals buried face down in unmarked pits. This reminds us that even in death, Viking society maintained elaborate status hierarchies. How you died mattered almost as much as why you died. A free man might face the sword poorly wielded, might endure multiple strikes, might die messily. But he died as a free man, with witnesses, with at least the possibility of single-stroke death and proper burial afterward. The next time you imagine Viking beheading as clean and honourable, picture instead those multiple blade marks on ancient vertebrae, evidence of executioners sawing through neck bones, of deaths that took several attempts and many seconds of consciousness. Honour was relative, and in Viking execution, relative honour still involved considerable suffering. Chapter 7. Blot Sacrifices, when execution meets religion. Now we enter complicated territory, where the line between criminal execution and religious sacrifice becomes deliberately blurred. The Vikings practiced blot, ritualised sacrifices to the gods, typically of animals but occasionally of humans. And the question that makes scholars uncomfortable is this: were some blot victims criminals being executed under religious cover? Were others volunteers seeking honour? Or were they slaves and prisoners who had no choice in becoming offerings? The answer, frustratingly, is probably all three depending on context. Picture the great blot at Uppsala, held according to Adam of Bremen every 9 years. The sacred grove fills with people from across the region. Animals hang from tree branches, horses, dogs, cattle, and, among them, human bodies. Adam claims 9 victims of each species, though his reliability as a Christian outsider reporting secondhand is questionable. What we can say with more certainty is that human sacrifice did occur in Norse religious practice, though its frequency and the selection of victims remain debated. Some victims may have been criminals whose execution was reframed as a religious offering. Others may have been captured enemies. And some, most disturbing to modern sensibilities, may have been willing participants who believed their sacrificial death would earn them honour and favourable afterlife. The dark truth about blot sacrifice is that willingness may have been socially constructed rather than freely chosen. Imagine a thrall, a slave, selected for sacrifice to Odin. Is this person's participation voluntary if the alternative is lifetime slavery? If their entire worldview teaches that honour comes through this death? If their community celebrates their selection rather than mourning it? The saga literature includes references to people seemingly honoured to be chosen for sacrifice, but we must read these accounts with scepticism. How much agency do these victims truly have? How much of their willingness was really just the internalisation of a system that made their death serve their master's religious needs? The archaeological evidence from sites like Tissø in Denmark shows specialised locations for sacrifice, distinct from ordinary execution grounds. At Tissø, researchers found evidence of ritual deposition of both human and animal remains in the lake, associated with a large Viking Age hall complex. The human remains show killing methods consistent with sacrifice descriptions in literature: hanging, drowning, throat cutting, often in combination. One individual showed evidence of all three: strangled with a rope, throat cut, body placed in water. This ritualistic overkill suggests religious purpose rather than simple execution, though the distinction may have been meaningless to the victim. The methods varied by which God received the offering. Odin, associated with death and wisdom, received hanging victims. Njörður and other water deities received drowning victims in bogs, wells, and lakes. Some victims had their throats cut over altars to collect blood for blessing ceremonies. The Heimskringla describes King Haakon's unwilling participation in a sacrifice where he was pressured to drink from a cup blessed with horse blood, suggesting even kings could not entirely escape these religious obligations, though being required to participate in sacrifice was considerably different from being the sacrifice. So the next time you encounter Viking sacrifice in popular culture, consider the layered reality. Some victims were criminals executed through religious ritual. Some were slaves with no meaningful choice. Some may have genuinely volunteered, believing in the honour of sacrificial death, and some were captured enemies, who certainly did not volunteer but whose death served both religious and political purposes. The boundary between execution and sacrifice was deliberately permeable, allowing Vikings to frame state violence as religious duty, to transform criminal death into divine offering, to make killing serve multiple social functions simultaneously. This category confusion troubles us, because we prefer our execution separate from our worship, revealing our assumption that religion should be distinct from state violence, an assumption Vikings did not share. Chapter 8. Breaking on wheels and stones. Some execution methods focus not on quick death, but on prolonged suffering. Breaking the body, systematically crushing bones with stones, wheels, or heavy implements, represented the most severe punishment for the worst crimes. While this method was less common in Norse culture than in later medieval Europe, archaeological evidence confirms it occurred, reserved for criminals whose offences were considered so heinous that quick death seemed insufficient. Imagine the execution of an oathbreaker convicted of betraying sacred trust in 11th century Norway. Oath-breaking ranked among the most despised crimes in Norse society, violating the fundamental bonds that held communities together. The condemned man is forced to lie on the ground while the community gathers to witness. Heavy stones are brought forward. The process begins with the extremities. Perhaps a stone dropped on the feet, crushing the small bones, then the shins, then working upward, each impact breaking bones but not immediately causing death. The body's natural shock responses would provide some mercy, but consciousness could persist for horrifying stretches of time. What made this method truly brutal was its publicity and duration. Unlike hanging or beheading, which could be relatively quick, breaking bones was a process that unfolded over minutes or even hours depending on the executioner's intentions. The community watched the entire spectacle. Children saw, elderly people saw. Everyone witnessed the systematic destruction of a human body as punishment for violating social norms. This was not just execution, but extended theatre of suffering, designed to impress upon witnesses the consequences of certain transgressions. The archaeological evidence comes primarily from skeletal remains, showing perimortem fractures, breaks that occurred at or near the time of death. A burial excavated at a Viking Age execution site in Sweden revealed a male skeleton with multiple long bone fractures showing no signs of healing, indicating the breaks occurred at death. The fracture patterns were consistent with blunt force trauma from heavy objects. The ribs bore similar damage. The skull showed evidence of crushing impact. Forensic analysis suggested the sequence: extremity bones broken first, then ribs, finally fatal skull trauma. The pattern indicates systematic, deliberate breaking rather than combat, injury or accident. This method was typically reserved for kinslayers and oathbreakers, crimes that struck at the heart of Norse social structure. Killing a family member violated the most sacred bonds. Breaking oaths destroyed the trust that made commerce, alliances, and justice possible. For these crimes, some Viking communities apparently believed that the body itself should be broken as symbolic punishment, that the physical destruction of the criminal's form matched the social destruction their crime had caused. The Graga law codes mention breaking as punishment, but frustratingly provide little detail about the exact methods, suggesting perhaps that the practice was too well known to require explanation, or too disturbing for legal clerks to document fully. This reminds us that execution served multiple functions beyond simply removing criminals from society. It communicated values, reinforced boundaries, created shared experiences of witnessed violence that bound communities together through collective participation in punishment. Breaking bodies made visible the social breaking that crimes like oath violation represented. So the next time you think of Viking execution as quick-sword death for criminals, remember that some deaths were designed to be slow, public, and symbolically meaningful. Bodies broken stone by stone as communities watched and remembered and warned their children not to commit the crimes that led to such ends. Chapter 9. The Practical Mechanics of Strangulation. Let us discuss, with clinical precision, exactly what happens during death by strangulation. This is not pleasant material, but understanding the mechanics reveals something important about Viking execution. Those who carried it out understood they were inflicting a specific, prolonged form of death, not a quick or merciful one. Strangulation, whether by hanging or direct neck compression, kills through one or both of two mechanisms, blocking blood flow to the brain or blocking airflow to the lungs. The timeline matters. Picture the physiological sequence. When a rope tightens around the neck, it typically compresses the carotid arteries that supply blood to the brain. If these vessels are effectively blocked, unconsciousness follows in approximately 10-15 seconds as the brain rapidly exhausts its oxygen supply. However, and this is crucial, maintaining enough pressure to keep someone unconscious requires continuous compression for 4-5 minutes until brain death occurs. Those are 4 to 5 very long minutes during which the executioner or the rope's tension must maintain lethal pressure. In Viking-era hangings without drop mechanisms, the victim's own body weight provided that pressure, but only if the knot placement was correct and the body position appropriate. What made strangulation truly disturbing was what witnesses saw during those minutes. Even after consciousness ceased, the body continued to respond. Convulsive movements would rack the limbs. The face would darken as blood pooled. Petechial hemorrhaging, tiny burst blood vessels, would appear in the eyes and face. The bladder and bowels would often release. Foam might appear at the mouth. These autonomic responses persisted even after brain death, giving the unsettling impression that the victim remained somehow aware, struggling against the rope for minutes after consciousness had actually fled. The archaeological evidence gives us uncomfortable specificity about these deaths. The Elling woman, discovered in a Danish bog in 1938, was found with her leather garrote still in place around her neck, a braided leather strip tightened to a circumference of about 13 centimetres, far too small for her neck's normal diameter. The compression had been severe and sustained. Her hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that often breaks during strangulation, showed fracture patterns consistent with lethal compression. Analysis of her remains suggested she was strangled with the cord and then hung or positioned in a way that maintained pressure even after consciousness ceased. She was perhaps 25 years old. Her hair had been elaborately arranged. Who she was and why she died remain mysteries, but how she died is forensically clear. Other bog bodies reveal similar evidence: rope marks preserved in skin, crushed hyoid bones, cervical vertebrae showing signs of extreme compression. In some cases, multiple methods were used. The victim strangled with a cord, then hanged, perhaps to ensure death was complete, or for ritual reasons we cannot determine. The Lindo man, found in England, showed evidence of both strangulation and a blow to the head. The sequence suggested he was likely struck unconscious first, a mercy of sorts, then strangled with a cord while already senseless. Even in execution, someone chose to reduce his suffering through that initial blow. It's hard not to reflect on what forensic science has done to our understanding of historical violence. 2,000 years ago, someone twisted a leather cord around the Elling woman's neck and maintained pressure for 5 minutes or more while her body's automatic responses played out. Now, we know her bone structures, her last meal, the exact mechanics of how she died. We can reconstruct those final minutes with medical precision. This knowledge makes her death uncomfortably real, transforming ancient execution from abstract historical event to specific individual trauma we can almost reconstruct second by second. The bog preserved evidence that allows us to turn execution victims into forensic case studies, giving us intimate knowledge we might prefer not to have of deaths we'd rather keep safely distant in time. Chapter 10: Child Executions and Age of Responsibility. Now we must confront one of the most difficult aspects of Viking justice: the execution of children and adolescents. Modern Western culture generally treats children as legally distinct from adults, with separate justice systems and extensive protections. Viking Age Scandinavia operated under different assumptions about when childhood ended and adult responsibility began, and the archaeological evidence suggests that youth did not always protect someone from capital punishment. Imagine a Thing assembly considering the case of a 14-year-old boy accused of theft, his third offence. In Viking legal thinking, he has reached an age where he can understand consequences and is therefore fully responsible for his actions. The assembly debates. His family offers compensation, but the plaintiff refuses. The boy's age comes up in discussion, but ultimately the legal framework treats him as capable of criminal intent and therefore subject to adult penalties. The assembly votes. The boy is sentenced to hanging. The execution occurs within days. To modern sensibilities, this seems monstrous. To the Vikings, it may have seemed unfortunate but legally consistent with their understanding of moral development and social responsibility. The dark truth is that we have archaeological evidence suggesting such executions occurred. Several bog bodies and execution site burials have been aged to adolescence, roughly 12-16 years old at death. The Kehausen boy, discussed earlier, was perhaps 14. The Winderby girl, later re-identified as possibly male, was approximately 16 when placed in a German bog with evidence suggesting intentional drowning. While we cannot definitively prove these were executions rather than sacrifices or murders, the patterns, careful body placement, apparent ritual elements, locations consistent with other execution sites, suggest these deaths occurred within legal or religious frameworks, not as random violence. The legal codes provide some clarity. The Greagas specifies that children under 12 could not be held fully responsible for their actions. Instead, their parents or guardians bore responsibility. but after age 12, a young person entered a transition period where culpability gradually increased. By 15 or 16, they were treated essentially as adults in legal contexts. This meant that adolescents could face adult penalties, including execution, for sufficiently serious crimes. The codes also specified that if a child committed murder, the family could be held responsible and required to pay compensation. But if compensation was refused, or the crime was particularly heinous, even a young perpetrator might face death. A saga reference, though sagas must always be read critically, describes a case where a teenage boy was executed for persistent theft after his family could no longer pay restitution. The account notes that some community members objected based on his youth, but the legal framework provided no explicit protection based on age alone once the threshold of responsibility had been crossed. The boy's execution proceeded, though the saga records it as a regrettable necessity rather than a triumphant justice. This distinction matters. Viking society apparently recognised the discomfort of executing young people, while still permitting it when their legal logic demanded. This reminds us forcefully that our culture-specific ideas about childhood, moral development and justice are not universal constants. To the Vikings, a 12-year-old who understood right from wrong was responsible for their choices. To us, adolescent brains are still developing. Culpability is diminished by age, and executing children represents a moral horror. Both systems have internal logic, but they produce radically different outcomes. So the next time you reflect on Viking justice, remember that it included the legal execution of adolescents who we would now consider children, revealing how thoroughly culture shapes our assumptions about age, responsibility, and the boundaries of legitimate state violence. The boring, disturbing truth is that Viking execution didn't exempt the young, and archaeology occasionally preserves the evidence of their deaths in bogs and execution grounds. Chapter 11. The executioner's role and social contamination. Someone had to carry out executions. This is the uncomfortable reality that every society with capital punishment must confront. That legal killing requires a killer, that state violence needs hands to perform it. In Viking Age Scandinavia, the role of executioner carried profound social and spiritual consequences. The person who tightened the noose, swung the sword, or held the victim beneath the water became contaminated by their proximity to death. They performed necessary work that everyone agreed must be done, yet found themselves ostracised for doing it. Picture an executioner's life in 10th century Norway. Perhaps he inherited the role from his father, who inherited it from his grandfather, a dynasty of death dealers that no one else would marry into. He lives on the settlement's outskirts, across a stream or beyond a boundary marker, in that liminal space between community and wilderness. When his services are required, a messenger comes to summon him. He crosses into the settlement proper, performs his duty at the designated execution ground, receives his payment, typically the dead person's clothing and possessions, items now considered as polluted as the executioner himself, and returns to his isolated dwelling. His children play alone. His wife, if he has one, comes from another executioner family. His entire existence is shaped by the contamination his necessary work brings. What made this isolation particularly cruel was its legal foundation. Saga literature and later medieval Scandinavian law codes explicitly categorized executioners as ritually unclean. Contact with death, especially deliberate killing, even legally sanctioned killing, created spiritual pollution that transferred to the killer. The executioner could not participate fully in religious ceremonies. He could not share meals with free farmers. His testimony in legal proceedings carried less weight. He was simultaneously essential to the legal system and excluded from full participation in the society that system protected. This paradox defined his existence: necessary but despised, legally authorized but spiritually contaminated. The compensation system reflected this paradox. Executioners typically received no monetary payment for their work. Instead, they inherited the dead person's possessions, clothing, tools, whatever the condemned owned. These items were already considered polluted by association with the executed criminal, so transferring them to the already polluted executioner made a certain twisted logic. In saga references, we occasionally see executioners living in poverty despite their regular income, because polluted goods held little trade value. Who would buy a tunic worn by a hanged man and then owned by the executioner? The contamination clung to objects as well as people. Some legal codes allowed convicted criminals to be forced into the executioner role as punishment, adding the spiritual pollution of the work to whatever penalty they already faced. A man convicted of a serious crime might be offered a choice: execution, or serving as executioner for a term of years. If he chose the latter, he saved his life but entered a social death of sorts, forever marked by the contamination of his work. One saga describes a man who accepted this bargain and spent the rest of his life in isolation, technically alive but socially dead, watching from the edges as the community continued without him. It's hard not to see the cruel hypocrisy in this system. Society collectively decided certain people must die, but then punished the individuals who carried out those collective decisions. The executioner absorbed the moral cost of state violence, allowing the community to maintain the fiction that they were not themselves killers. This reminds us that every execution system requires scapegoats, someone to bear the burden of killing so that everyone else can maintain clean hands. The Vikings made this explicit through their belief in spiritual pollution, but every society that practices capital punishment creates its own version of the executioner's isolation, its own ways of distancing the community from the violence done in its name. Chapter 12. Burning. Rare but meaningful. Fire holds a unique place in human psychology, simultaneously a source of life-giving warmth and potentially the most agonizing form of death. Vikings used burning for execution only rarely, reserving it for specific crimes that required purification beyond what other methods could provide. Sorcery, certain forms of sexual transgression, and occasionally crimes considered spiritually polluting might earn death by fire. The rarity of this method makes it more, not less, significant for understanding Viking attitudes toward execution and spiritual danger. Imagine the preparation for a burning execution in 11th century Iceland. A woman has been convicted of Seda, the form of magic associated with women, considered both powerful and morally suspect. The legal assembly has pronounced sentence, death by fire. The community gathers at a designated location, perhaps a stone circle or boundary area. Wood is stacked, but not in a high pyre that would consume quickly. Instead, a lower structure is built, designed to burn slowly. The woman is bound to a stake. The fire is lit at the edges. And then comes the horrifying reality of burning death, not the quick consumption of dramatic television, but slow cooking as heat gradually increases. The dark truth about burning alive is its extended duration. A properly built execution pyre, designed for visibility and symbolism rather than mercy, could take 30 minutes or longer to kill. The physiological sequence is nightmare fuel. First, the heat causes pain receptors to fire continuously as skin begins to burn. Then, as temperature increases, nerve endings are destroyed, creating paradoxical pain relief even as deeper tissue damage accelerates. Smoke inhalation might bring earlier unconsciousness. A mercy if the fire was smoky enough. But a clear burning fire in open air could mean consciousness persisted while skin charred, fat liquefied, muscle contracted from heat. Death finally came from shock, fluid loss, or asphyxiation as airways swelled shut, but it came slowly. The saga literature provides sparse references to burning executions, suggesting their rarity. When they occur in the texts, they're almost always associated with sorcery accusations or sexual crimes considered particularly polluting. The Ebigya saga mentions a woman burned for witchcraft, though the account provides frustratingly little detail. Other references appear in Christianized texts describing pagan practices, but these must be read critically as they may reflect Christian assumptions about appropriate punishment for heresy rather than actual pagan Norse practices. What we can say with more confidence is that burning served a purification function. Fire cleansed spiritual pollution in a way other execution methods could not. The archaeological evidence for burning execution is nearly non-existent, which itself tells us something. Fire destroys bone and tissue, leaving little trace. Unlike hanging or drowning, which preserve bodies for archaeological study, burning removes the evidence of its own occurrence. We must rely primarily on textual sources, which are frustratingly vague. This absence of physical evidence means we cannot know precisely how common burning execution was, though the textual references suggest it was rare relative to hanging, beheading, and drowning. What burning reveals about Viking execution is the belief that some crimes required purification beyond simple death. The fire didn't just kill the criminal, it cleansed the spiritual pollution their crime had created. This reflects a worldview where criminal acts could contaminate the community spiritually, requiring not just removal of the criminal, but active purification through fire's transformative power. So the next time you think of Viking execution, remember that the rare use of burning marked it as special, reserved for crimes that threatened not just social order but spiritual purity. The boring historical reality is that burning was uncommon precisely because it was so meaningful. Too significant a ritual to use for ordinary criminals, reserved for cases where fire's purifying power was specifically required. Chapter 13. Drowning in the Ocean. Tides and Timing. The ocean itself could become executioner through careful timing and the inexorable rhythm of tides. This method of execution required specific geography, coastal settlements with significant tidal variation, but where it was practiced, it combined the slow certainty of drowning with the psychological torture of watching death approach incrementally over hours. The condemned victim would be staked at the low tide line, then left to wait as the water slowly, inevitably rose to cover their face. Picture the execution scene on a Norwegian fjord coast. The morning low tide exposes mudflats and rocks. A woman convicted of infanticide is brought to the execution ground at the water's edge. Her hands are bound behind her back. She is tied or staked to a large rock or wooden post driven into the tidal zone. The executioners retreat. The witnesses gather on higher ground, and then everyone simply waits. The tide begins its return. Water appears first as distant fingers probing between rocks, then as shallow pools forming in depressions, then as a general sheet advancing across the mudflat. All while the condemned woman watches its approach. What made tide drowning particularly cruel was the extended timeline it imposed. Depending on tidal range and the victim's exact positioning, the process could take 3 to 6 hours from the moment of staking to the moment of death. For the first hour or more, the rising water might only reach the victim's feet, then ankles, then knees, uncomfortable but not yet deadly. The real terror began when water reached chest height, making breathing difficult, then neck height, requiring the victim to tilt their head back to keep nose and mouth clear, and finally, the inevitable moment when even the most extreme head position couldn't keep airways above water. The physiological reality of saltwater drowning adds additional horror. When someone drowns in fresh water, the lungs absorb water rapidly into the bloodstream, causing electrolyte imbalances that can stop the heart. Saltwater drowning works differently. The salt draws fluid from the bloodstream into the lungs, creating a suffocating foam that prevents oxygen exchange. The victim essentially drowns in their own bodily fluids mixed with seawater. Panic responses would begin as soon as water covered the mouth. Involuntary gasping, breath holding that could only last a few minutes at most, and finally the desperate inhalation that filled lungs with water and foam. Consciousness might persist for 30-90 seconds after that final breath. Death followed within 3 to 5 minutes once the lungs filled. The saga literature rarely mentions this specific method, though references to drowning in the sea appear occasionally. The lack of detailed accounts may reflect the method's relative rarity. It required specific coastal conditions and tidal patterns. Archaeological evidence is essentially impossible, as bodies staked in tidal zones would be swept away by currents, consumed by marine scavengers, and dispersed by wave action. Unlike bog drownings that preserve bodies, ocean drownings leave no trace. We know the method existed primarily from scattered textual references and from comparative evidence of similar practices in other coastal medieval cultures. What tide drowning reveals is how Vikings used their natural environment as execution tool. The ocean's rhythm became the killer, requiring no sustained human effort beyond the initial staking. The community could watch from a distance, participating in the execution through witness while maintaining physical separation from the act of killing. This method transformed nature itself into executioner, creating a kind of moral distance that may have made the death easier for witnesses to accept. Yet for the victim, that distance must have provided no comfort. Watching water creep closer for hours, knowing exactly when and how death would come, unable to do anything but wait as the tide fulfilled its inevitable function. Chapter 14. The Nithing Pole. Social death. Before physical death. Before we can understand Viking execution fully, we must recognise that death came in forms beyond the physical. The Nithing Pole, Nidstong in Old Norse, represented one of the most feared forms of legal and magical punishment, the declaration that someone was socially dead, spiritually cursed, legally non-existent, and often social death preceded and even exceeded physical death in its terror and consequences. Imagine discovering a nithing pole erected at your property boundary in 10th century Iceland. A tall wooden pole stands driven into the earth. Atop it sits a horse's head, positioned to face toward your dwelling. Runes are carved into the pole's shaft, curses invoking the Landvetir, land spirits, against you, declaring you Nidinga, nothing, nobody, worthless. The pole pronounces you socially dead before the community. You're no longer a person with legal rights. No one can shelter you without becoming contaminated by your status. Your property reverts to your accusers. Your children are shamed. Your name becomes an insult. You have become, quite literally, nothing. What made the Nithing Pole truly devastating was its combination of legal, social and spiritual effects. Legally, it often accompanied formal outlaw declaration. You lost all legal protection, could be killed without penalty, could own no property. Socially, it marked you as deserving universal contempt. The term Nidinga carried connotations of cowardice, unmanliness, moral worthlessness that could never be fully washed away even if you survived. Spiritually, the pole's curses were believed to invoke supernatural forces against you, turning the very land spirits hostile, making you unwelcome even in the natural world. This triple condemnation, legal, social, spiritual, made the Nithing Pole potentially worse than execution. The saga literature provides several dramatic Nithing Pole accounts, most famously in Egil's saga. Egil Skallagrimsson, the warrior poet, erects a Nithing Pole against King Eric Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild. He places a horse's head atop the pole and speaks formal curses invoking the land spirits against the royal couple, demanding they be driven from Norway. The saga treats this as a powerful and dangerous act of magic-enhanced legal condemnation. Whether the historical Egil actually performed this ritual, or whether the saga author invented it for dramatic effect, remains debated, but the story's power reveals how seriously Norse culture took the Nithing declaration. The archaeological evidence for Nithing poles is frustratingly absent. Wooden poles don't survive in the archaeological record except under unusual preservation conditions. We have no confirmed examples of actual nithing poles discovered through excavation. This absence doesn't mean they didn't exist. It simply means that material culture evidence is limited to textual sources and later folk traditions. What we can say is that the concept of social death through public cursing and shame appears across multiple saga texts and law codes, suggesting it was a recognised legal and magical practice, even if its exact implementation varied. The psychological impact of nithing declaration must have been profound. For people whose entire identity was embedded in social relationships and reputation, becoming nothing was a kind of death that continued after your heart stopped beating. Your name became a curse. Your descendants carried your shame. Even if you physically escaped to another land, you carried the spiritual pollution with you. Some people declared nithing chose physical death, either through combat seeking honourable death to restore some reputation, or through suicide to escape the unbearable shame. Others fled to the wilderness, becoming the outlaws and wanderers of saga literature, legally and socially dead while physically alive. This reminds us that execution in Viking culture wasn't always about ending biological life. Social death through nithing declaration could be worse than physical execution, because it extended beyond the individual to stain their entire family line, because it denied even the possibility of honourable death, because it made the victim nothing, a category of non-being more terrible than simple corpsehood. So the next time you think of Viking execution, remember the nithing pole, the execution that happened before physical death, the killing of social identity that sometimes led to, but always exceeded the mere ending of breath and heartbeat. Chapter 15. Multiple method executions. Overkill as ritual now. We must confront one of the most puzzling aspects of Viking Age execution, the evidence of multiple killing methods applied to single victims. Archaeological analysis of bog bodies and execution burials reveals cases where people were killed 2, 3, even 4 different ways simultaneously or in rapid sequence. This overkill wasn't accidental or sadistic. It appears to have been deliberate, ritual and meaningful, though its exact meaning remains frustratingly unclear. Picture the archaeological moment when Inhumane was discovered in an English peat bog in 1984. His body, preserved by bog chemistry for approximately 2,000 years, showed evidence of a carefully orchestrated death. First, he'd received a powerful blow to the top of his head with a blunt instrument, fracturing his skull. Second, a cord had been twisted around his neck, strangling him. Third, his throat had been cut, severing major blood vessels. And finally, he had been placed face down in the bog water where, if he had somehow survived the previous 3 methods, he would have drowned. 4 different killing methods applied to one person. Why? The dark truth is that we cannot know with certainty why Vikings, or their cultural predecessors, Inhumane predates the Viking Age proper, but represents a continuous Northern European tradition of bog sacrifice execution, sometimes used multiple killing methods. The scholarly interpretations vary. Some suggest ritual sacrifice to multiple gods, with each deity receiving their preferred killing method. Others propose that multiple methods ensured death was absolutely certain, leaving no possibility of survival. Still others argue that the sequence represents escalating violence, with each method applied because the previous one hadn't immediately killed the victim. The evidence doesn't definitively support any single interpretation. What we can say with confidence is that multiple method executions appear across multiple archaeological sites and time periods in Northern Europe. The Grabal man had his throat cut with such force that the wound extended from ear to ear. The Tolland man was hanged. The Elling woman was strangled and possibly drowned. The Winderby girl, later thought to be possibly male, was drowned and had one side of the head shaved, a possible mark of shame. Several bog bodies show evidence of being struck on the head, strangled, stabbed and drowned in various combinations. This pattern suggests intentional practice, rather than random violence or botched executions. The overkill pattern tells us something important about how Vikings, and their cultural ancestors, conceived of death and killing. In a worldview where death had spiritual significance, where the manner of death mattered for the afterlife, where different gods governed different forms of death, applying multiple killing methods might have served to dedicate the victim to multiple deities, or to ensure they were thoroughly, absolutely, spiritually as well as physically dead. The redundancy wasn't practical. One method would suffice to stop breathing, but symbolic, transforming execution into elaborate ritual, whose full meaning we can only guess at. One particularly haunting aspect of multiple method executions is the question of sequence and consciousness. When was each method applied? If someone was struck unconscious first, the subsequent strangling, stabbing and drowning would have occurred while they were senseless, a mercy of sorts. But if strangling came first, leaving the victim conscious but dying, did they experience the subsequent blade cut and water immersion? The archaeological evidence sometimes allows forensic pathologists to determine sequence, but not always. We can identify the methods, but cannot always reconstruct the experience of dying through all of them. So the next time you encounter a simple hanging or beheading in Viking execution accounts, remember the bog bodies with their multiple traumas. Remember Lindoman with his head trauma, ligature strangulation, throat cutting and drowning. Remember that Viking execution sometimes involved not just ending life, but doing so through elaborate multi-method rituals whose meanings have died with their practitioners. The boring historical truth is that we have clear evidence of what was done, but only speculation about why. A reminder that archaeology gives us actions, but not always intentions, bodies, but not always beliefs, methods, but not always meanings. Chapter 16. Exposure. The slow death. Not all Viking executions involved active killing. Some simply placed the condemned in circumstances where nature would do the work, leaving them tied or staked in place to die from exposure to the Scandinavian climate. This method carried a peculiar moral quality. Technically, no human hand directly killed the victim. Instead, cold, hunger, thirst, and eventually predators or scavengers brought death over a period of days. The executioners could claim a certain distance from the killing, even as they had deliberately created the conditions that made death inevitable. Imagine a thrall convicted of stealing food from his master's stores in early winter Norway. The punishment is exposure. He is taken to a boundary area between settlements, that liminal space Vikings favoured for executions, and tied to a standing post or tree. His hands are bound behind him around the trunk. Perhaps his ankles are tied as well, preventing even the slight warmth that movement might generate. Then the executioners simply leave. The community returns to their daily life, and the condemned man remains, alone as temperature drops and darkness falls. The physiological progression of death by exposure in Scandinavian winter is clinically documented and deeply unpleasant. First comes the shivering response as the body attempts to generate heat through muscle contractions. This can persist for hours, exhausting the victim while providing diminishing returns. As core temperature drops below 35 degrees, 95 degrees, hypothermia begins its progression through stages. Mild hypothermia brings confusion and impaired judgment. Moderate hypothermia causes drowsiness, slurred speech, and paradoxical undressing. Victims sometimes remove clothing despite being freezing, a phenomenon caused by peripheral blood vessels dilating and creating a false sensation of warmth. Severe hypothermia brings unconsciousness, and finally, as core temperature drops below 20 degrees, cardiac arrest. Death might come within 12 to 24 hours in true winter conditions, or could take several days if weather was milder. But cold alone wasn't the only killer. Dehydration proceeded simultaneously. Human bodies need water, and bound exposure victims couldn't access it. After 48 to 72 hours without water, dehydration begins causing serious organ stress. The tongue swells, lips crack, kidney function deteriorates. Hunger mattered less. Humans can survive weeks without food. but thirst could kill within days. And then there were the scavengers. Saga literature includes references to wolves, ravens, and other carrion animals visiting exposure sites. Whether they attacked before death or waited until after is a question the sagas leave disturbingly ambiguous. The archaeological evidence for exposure execution is necessarily indirect. Unlike hanging or drowning, exposure leaves no clear skeletal markers. A body found at a boundary location with evidence of having been bound tells us someone died tied up, but not whether this was execution by exposure, post-mortem treatment, or some other circumstance. We rely more heavily on textual sources, saga references and law codes that mention exposure as punishment, particularly for slaves and serious property crimes. The Gragas mentions that thralls could be left at the mercy of the elements for certain offences, a phrase that likely refers to exposure execution. This reminds us of our curious human capacity to create moral distance from violence through passivity. Exposure execution involved no active striking, stabbing, or strangling. The executioners simply created conditions and left nature to complete the process. This distinction mattered in cultures where direct killing carried spiritual pollution. By contrast, leaving someone to die without direct action might have seemed less contaminating, though no less fatal. So the next time you consider Viking execution methods, remember that some deaths came not from violence, but from abandonment, not from action, but from deliberate inaction that let climate, dehydration, and scavengers do the work human hands would not. Chapter 17. Post-execution. Treatment of bodies. The violence of execution did not end when the condemned person stopped breathing. What happened to the body afterward reveals as much about Viking attitudes toward crime and death as the execution methods themselves, and the archaeological evidence makes clear that executed criminals received treatment in death that marked them as permanently different from those who died natural deaths, denied proper burial, placed in liminal locations, sometimes mutilated or staked to prevent them from walking after death. Picture the aftermath of a hanging in 10th century Denmark. The body has been left on the gallows for 3 days as law requires, a public display of justice completed. Now it must be dealt with. But unlike a person who died naturally, who would be washed, dressed in good clothing, buried with care in the community cemetery with grave goods and proper ritual, the executed criminal receives no such treatment. The body is cut down and dragged to the settlement boundary. A shallow pit is dug, not the careful, deep burial of respected dead, but a minimal hole. The body is thrown in face down, a deliberate inversion of proper burial position. No grave goods, no marker. Sometimes heavy stones are placed on top, physically pinning the corpse to prevent it from rising. What made post-execution burial practices truly disturbing was their deliberate deviance from normal treatment of the dead. Archaeological excavations of execution cemeteries reveal patterns that appear across multiple sites. Bodies buried face down or on their sides, rather than the typical supine position. Burial at property boundaries, crossroads, or other liminal locations rather than in community cemeteries. Shallow graves rather than proper depth. Absence of grave goods that would normally accompany even poor burials. Evidence of stones or stakes placed atop or through bodies. All of these practices marked executed criminals as dangerous dead, requiring containment even in death. The concern was Draugr, the undead. Norse belief held that certain dead could return to trouble the living, and those who died violently or dishonourably were particularly prone to become Draugr. An executed criminal, killed in public shame, denied proper burial, buried in unconsecrated ground, was exactly the type of dead most likely to walk. Face-down burial prevented the corpse from easily rising. Heavy stones physically pinned it. Burial at crossroads or boundaries confused the spirit, unable to find its way back to the community. In extreme cases, beheading the already dead body and burying the head separately from the body prevented the Draugr from being whole enough to walk. These practices reveal anxiety. The executed needed to stay dead, and elaborate precautions ensured they did. Some executed criminals received no burial at all. Bodies left hanging for extended periods might be partially consumed by scavengers before being cut down. What remained would be left to decompose in place, bones eventually scattering. Drowning victims whose bodies weren't recovered simply remained wherever water took them. The complete absence of burial rites represented the ultimate dishonour. Not just death, but erasure. Transformation from person to rotting meat to scattered bones to nothing. Saga literature occasionally references this fate, treating it as particularly shameful even by execution standards. Archaeological excavations at sites like the Ridgeway Hill mass grave in Dorset show how execution victims might receive mass burial with no individual care. 54 decapitated bodies thrown into a large pit, heads tossed in separately, no attempt to match head to body or arrange corpses with dignity. This was disposal of human remains, not burial of respected dead. The contrast with nearby cemeteries, where contemporaneous people received careful individual burial with grave goods and proper positioning, could not be starker. Death was not the end of punishment. The treatment of the body extended violence and dishonour beyond the moment of death. So the next time you think of Viking executioners ending with the last breath, remember that for executed criminals the violence continued. Remember the face-down burials, the stones pinning corpses to earth, the headless bodies in unmarked pits at boundaries, the bones left to scatter where they fell. Execution killed the person, but post-execution treatment killed their dignity, their possibility of peaceful rest, even their physical integrity. This reminds us that justice, or vengeance, could extend beyond life into death, denying even the basic respect accorded to bodies and cultures that took death ritual very seriously. Chapter 18. Gendered executions, different deaths for different sexes. Viking execution methods were not gender neutral. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals that women and men frequently died by different methods even when convicted of similar crimes. These gendered patterns reflected deep cultural beliefs about appropriate treatment of male and female bodies, about honour and shame, about blood pollution and spiritual danger. Understanding these differences reveals how thoroughly gender shaped every aspect of Viking life, even its ending. Imagine two executions on the same day in 11th century Norway. A man and a woman have both been convicted of theft, their third offences, making execution the prescribed penalty. The man is taken to the hanging ground, where he will be publicly strangled at rope's end, his body displayed for days before burial. The woman, however, is led to a different location, a bog or deep well. She is drowned, her body submerged in water, disappearing from sight. Both die for the same crime, but the methods and their meanings differ profoundly. The man's death is public, visible, marked by the sight of his suspended body. The woman's death is hidden, contained within water, erasing her from view. The dark pattern, revealed by bog body analysis, is striking. Of the hundreds of bog bodies discovered across northern Europe, roughly 60% are female, despite women making up a smaller percentage of the archaeological record generally. This suggests that drowning in bogs was disproportionately used for women. The reasons appear both practical and symbolic. Practically, women's smaller average body size made drowning easier than hanging. Less strength required to hold someone underwater than to haul them up with rope. Symbolically, water burial avoided visible blood and kept female bodies concealed, reflecting beliefs about proper treatment of women's corpses. The textual evidence from saga literature and law codes supports this archaeological pattern. Women convicted of infanticide, a crime culturally coded as female, typically faced drowning. Men convicted of murder typically faced hanging or beheading. Women accused of sexual crimes or sorcery might be drowned or rarely burned. Men accused of oath-breaking or cowardice might be subjected to more public forms of execution that emphasise their dishonour before the community. The pattern suggests that female executions emphasise concealment and erasure, while male executions emphasise public display and visible dishonour. This gendered difference extended to burial treatment. Analysis of execution cemeteries shows that beheaded male bodies were sometimes buried with some degree of care, face down to prevent rising as Draugr, but still in marked graves at recognised execution sites. Female execution victims, particularly those drowned in bogs, simply disappeared into the water. Their bodies might be discovered centuries later by peat cutters, or might decompose completely in water before ever being found. The distinction between public death and hidden death, between marked grave and water disappearance, reinforced gender hierarchies even in death. The belief system underlying these practices connected to concepts of blood pollution and spiritual danger. In Norse thought, women's bodies were already associated with mysterious and potentially dangerous forces: menstruation, childbirth, certain forms of magic. Executing a woman through methods that avoided visible blood or kept the body concealed may have been about controlling these perceived dangers. Men's bodies, by contrast, could be publicly displayed, their blood openly spilled, without the same spiritual concerns. Gender shaped not just life but death, not just crimes but punishments, not just legal status but the very methods used to end life and dispose of the body. This reminds us that execution practices always reflect and reinforce broader cultural hierarchies. Viking Age Scandinavians executed people of different genders differently because gender fundamentally shaped their worldview. So the next time you encounter Viking execution in history or fiction, ask, whose death is this? If the condemned is male, expect public hanging or beheading. If female, expect drowning or concealed death. The method was never neutral. It was always gendered, always reflecting cultural beliefs about appropriate treatment of male and female bodies, even in the ultimate act of state violence. Chapter 19. The Audience. Community Participation in Death. Viking executions were not private affairs. They were public spectacles that required community participation, not as entertainment precisely, though elements of that existed, but as civic duty. Witness to execution served multiple social functions: legal verification that justice was completed, collective sharing of responsibility for the death, reinforcement of social norms through visible consequences, and the binding of community through shared experience of witnessing violence. To understand Viking execution, we must understand its audience. Picture the crowd gathering for an execution at Thing assembly site in Iceland. The date was announced days ago, allowing people to arrange attendance. Farmers have travelled from surrounding areas with their families. Children stand among adults. This is considered educational, not inappropriate. The legal case has been heard publicly, the sentence pronounced, and now the community gathers to witness its implementation. When the condemned person is brought forward, when the rope tightens or the sword falls, hundreds of eyes watch. This is not optional attendance for most community members. Their presence serves as legal testimony that the execution occurred as prescribed. What made execution attendance truly significant was its legal function. In a society without extensive written records or professional bureaucracy, how did communities verify that sentences were carried out? Through witness. People who attended executions could be called upon later to testify that they saw the death, that it occurred according to proper procedure, that justice was completed. Their attendance wasn't just passive watching, but active legal participation. This transformed execution from something done to a criminal into something done by the entire community, with the executioner as merely the hand performing what collective will decreed. The psychological impact on witnesses varied, but could be profound. Saga literature occasionally preserves accounts of people's reactions to watching execution. Some showed appropriate solemnity, treating it as serious legal business. Others apparently found it disturbing enough to mention in their own later accounts. Children brought to watch executions as part of their education in law and consequences might carry those memories for life. One saga describes a man whose first vivid childhood memory was watching a hanging. The image burned into his mind with uncomfortable permanence. What effect did regular exposure to execution have on Viking Age people? We can only speculate, but the casual mention of executions in saga literature suggests a degree of normalisation we might find disturbing. The communal witness also served to distribute moral responsibility. When a community collectively decided someone must die, when they collectively attended the execution, when they collectively witnessed the death, no single person bore sole responsibility. The executioner's hands performed the act, but the community's eyes authorised it. This distribution of guilt allowed societies to practice capital punishment while maintaining individual conscience. Everyone participated, so no one was uniquely guilty. The blood was on all hands equally, which somehow made it easier to bear than if it had been on one person's hands alone. Yet not all watching was solemn duty. Saga references suggest that some executions included feast elements, food shared after the killing, a combination of legal proceeding and social gathering. The line between witnessing as duty and watching as entertainment blurred in ways that make modern readers uncomfortable. Were Vikings entertained by executions? The honest answer is probably that some were, some weren't, and many experienced complex mixtures of duty, disgust, fascination, and relief that it was someone else dying. Human psychology around witnessing death is complicated across all cultures and all times. This reminds us that executions are inherently public acts, even when conducted in private. They represent state power, community values, collective decisions about who deserves to die. Vikings made this explicit by requiring attendance, by building execution into their legal assemblies, by treating witness as civic responsibility. So the next time you imagine a Viking execution, don't picture just the condemned and the executioner. Picture the hundreds of witnesses, the children learning about justice, the families sharing the burden of collective killing, the community bound together through shared experience of watching someone die because their laws and their values declared that death necessary. Chapter 20. Failed executions and survival. Not all executions succeeded. Ropes broke, swords struck poorly, victims revived after being left for dead. And when executions failed, Viking communities faced difficult questions. Was survival a sign of divine intervention? Should the victim be pardoned or killed again? What did failure say about the justice of the original sentence? The saga literature preserves several accounts of failed executions, revealing that the process of legal killing was sometimes messier, more uncertain, and more contested than we might imagine. Picture a hanging execution in 10th century Iceland where the rope breaks under the condemned man's weight. He falls to the ground, gasping, alive. The crowd murmurs. Is this a sign from the gods? Some argue that divine intervention has spared him, that he should be pardoned. Others insist the sentence must be fulfilled, that a new rope must be found. The legal precedent is unclear. Do failed executions void the sentence? The Thing Assembly must reconvene to debate. Hours pass while the condemned man sits under guard, in that strange limbo between life and death, his fate being argued while his neck still bears rope marks from the first attempt. The dark truth about failed executions was that they exposed the brutality of the process by requiring its repetition. When an execution succeeded on first attempt, death came relatively quickly, and witnesses could maintain the fiction that justice was clean, necessary, and ordained. When execution failed and had to be repeated, that fiction shattered. The condemned person's continued survival became an accusation. their presence a reminder that the community was actively choosing to kill them, choosing to try again, choosing to make certain this time what they had failed to accomplish before. The second attempt carried none of the moral certainty of the first. Saga accounts preserve several failed execution narratives, though their historical reliability is always questionable. One story describes a man sentenced to hanging who survived when the branch broke. The community interpreted this as divine intervention and commuted his sentence to outlawry instead. Still a death sentence in practical terms, but one that allowed the gods rather than human hands to complete the killing. Another account tells of someone reviving after hanging, having been cut down too soon and buried prematurely. The gravedigger, hearing noises from the burial pit, fled in terror. The corpse climbed out and escaped to another region, living years longer under a new identity. The legal implications of survival varied by circumstance and community decision. Some law codes addressed failed executions explicitly, specifying that if certain signs of divine intervention appeared, rope breaking, 3 failed attempts, spontaneous revival after apparent death, the sentence could be commuted to lesser punishment. Other codes insisted execution must be completed regardless of initial failure, treating survival as mere technical difficulty rather than meaningful sign. The lack of consistent legal treatment suggests this was contested territory, with different communities and time periods handling it differently. What failed executions reveal most clearly is the constructed nature of execution's authority. When everything went as planned, rope held, sword struck clean, death came quickly, the process seemed inevitable, ordained, natural consequence following logically from crime and sentence. When execution failed, that inevitability shattered. The condemned person's continued living became a question mark, a challenge to the legal system's authority, a reminder that nothing about this process was natural or automatic, but rather represented human choices that could fail, be contested, be reversed. The messiness of failed execution exposed the messiness of justice itself. So the next time you imagine Viking execution as a smooth, inevitable process moving from crime to sentence to death, remember the broken ropes and poor sword strikes. Remember the debates about divine intervention when victims survived. Remember the condemned people sitting in limbo while communities argued about whether to try again. Execution's brutality became especially visible when it failed, forcing communities to confront repeatedly what they could more easily ignore when death came efficiently on first attempt. Chapter 21. Slavery and Execution. The Cheap Life. To understand Viking execution fully, we must confront the uncomfortable reality of thraldom, slavery. The enslaved population of Viking Age Scandinavia lived under radically different legal frameworks than free people, and nowhere was this disparity more visible than in capital punishment. A free farmer might only face execution for murder, repeated serious theft, or other grave crimes. A thrall could be executed for breaking a tool, stealing a loaf of bread, or simply because their owner decided they deserved death. The law made life literally cheap when that life was enslaved. Imagine the legal reality for a thrall in 10th century Norway. You are property, not person. Your owner can beat you, sell you, work you until your body breaks, or kill you with minimal legal consequence. If you steal food because you're hungry, theft. If you break an expensive tool through accident, destruction of property more valuable than your life. If you speak back to your owner, insubordination. Any of these could earn death, and your execution would not require the elaborate legal process of thing assembly, witness testimony, and communal decision. Your owner simply decided, and you died. Perhaps they performed the execution themselves. Perhaps they designated another thrall to do it, spreading the pollution of killing among the already polluted enslaved population. What made thrall execution particularly disturbing was its casual, undocumented nature. When free people were executed, sagas might record it. Thing assemblies would have documentation, witnesses would remember and potentially testify. When thralls were executed, no one bothered recording it most of the time. They simply disappeared from the archaeological and historical record. We know thrall execution happened routinely because law codes mention it in passing, because saga literature occasionally references it as unremarkable background detail, because the entire legal framework treated enslaved life as fundamentally less valuable than free life. But we cannot count the bodies, cannot name the victims, cannot reconstruct most of their deaths. They died in obscurity because their lives were lived in obscurity. The archaeological evidence for mass thrall execution is limited but suggestive. Some mass grave sites contain individuals buried without grave goods, in poor locations with evidence of violent death. Possible markers of slave status, though always difficult to confirm definitively. One excavation in Sweden revealed a pit containing multiple individuals with execution-style trauma, buried hastily with no ceremony. Were these thralls killed during a raid, or executed slaves, or something else? The archaeology cannot tell us with certainty, but the casual disposal of bodies marked them as people considered unworthy of burial care. The saga literature occasionally preserves glimpses of this casual violence. One saga mentions a farmer executing a thrall for theft, with no more narrative weight than if he had slaughtered a chicken. Another describes multiple thralls killed during a dispute, their deaths not legally investigated because they were property damage rather than murder. The law codes from Iceland and Norway explicitly specified different penalties for killing free people versus thralls. Killing a free person required were guild, compensation payment, or resulted in blood feud and potential execution. Killing someone else's thrall required compensating the owner for property loss, as if you had broken their plough. Killing your own thrall required no compensation at all. This reminds us that legal systems always reflect hierarchies, and Viking legal frameworks made clear that not all lives held equal value. Thrall execution happened frequently, casually, with minimal oversight or documentation, because enslaved people existed outside the protections that free people took for granted. So the next time you think of Viking execution as a measured legal process, requiring thing assembly and communal witness, remember that this only applied to free people. For the enslaved population, perhaps 10 to 20% of Viking Age Scandinavian society, execution could come at any moment, for any reason, with no appeal and no record. Their cheap lives ended cheaply, documented mainly through their absence from the archaeological record. Chapter 22. Execution as entertainment versus solemn duty. We must now wrestle with an uncomfortable question about Viking execution. Did people enjoy watching? Modern observers want to believe that executions were purely solemn legal proceedings, grim necessities that communities attended out of duty rather than desire. But human psychology around witnessing death is complex across all cultures, and Vikings were no exception. The evidence suggests a tension between execution as serious legal duty and execution as public spectacle, a tension that reveals uncomfortable truths about how humans respond to institutionalized violence. Imagine a thing, assembly in Iceland, where an execution is scheduled as part of the legal proceedings. The assembly itself is the social event of the season. Families have travelled days to attend, setting up temporary camps around the assembly site. There is feasting, trading, socialising, political negotiation, marriage arrangements being made, and among all this social activity there is also execution. When the time comes for the condemned person to be brought forward, does the crowd grow solemn, or does conversation continue? Do children stop playing, or do parents use the moment as teaching opportunity while maintaining their own casual demeanour? The saga literature frustratingly provides no clear answer, leaving us to speculate. What made this tension particularly revealing was how saga authors sometimes described execution scenes. Some accounts treat execution with appropriate gravity, solemn pronouncements, the condemned person's final words recorded. witnesses described as serious and thoughtful. Other accounts mention executions almost in passing, as background detail to more important political events. One saga describes an execution occurring while a feast continues nearby, suggesting the two events occupied the same social space without requiring all attention to shift to the death. This casual mention troubles modern readers who want executions to be always solemn, always grave, never integrated into normal social life. The anthropological context helps explain this tension. In pre-modern societies without mass media, public executions were among the few occasions when large crowds gathered to witness dramatic events. They served simultaneously as legal proceeding, social gathering, and yes, entertainment. Not in the sense of frivolous amusement, but in the sense of any public spectacle that draws crowds and provides material for conversation and memory. Medieval and early modern societies across Europe, Asia, and elsewhere integrated execution into public life in ways that strike us as callous but reflected different relationships with death, violence, and public spectacle. The Viking feast elements associated with some execution support this interpretation. References exist to food being shared after executions, to legal proceedings including both trials and executions being embedded in larger social gatherings. The Thing assemblies where executions occurred were already multi-day events that mixed legal business, religious observance, trade, and social networking. Execution was one component of this complex social event, treated with seriousness but not necessarily separating it entirely from the broader festive atmosphere. We want clear boundaries, either solemn legal duty or entertainment, but Viking reality may have been messier, with elements of both coexisting uncomfortably. Yet we must be careful not to project later European execution practices too directly onto Vikings. The elaborate execution spectacles of early modern Europe, with their theatrical staging, their printed broadsides, their deliberate entertainment elements, came later and reflected different social contexts. Vikings' executions were likely less theatrical, less deliberately staged for audience enjoyment. But the human tendency to experience fascination, horror, and yes, a kind of grim engagement when witnessing death transcends culture and time. Vikings were human, and humans have always had complicated responses to witnessing violence, mixing duty, disgust, fascination, and relief in ways we struggle to articulate even today. This reminds us that human responses to institutionalized violence are never simple or pure. Modern executions in countries that still practice capital punishment are hidden behind prison walls precisely because societies recognize that making death public creates complicated responses in witnesses. Vikings made their executions public, embedded them in social gatherings, and apparently accepted the tension between solemnity and spectacle as unavoidable aspect of human nature. So the next time you imagine a Viking execution, don't assume purely solemn witness. Consider instead the complicated reality of humans watching other humans die, experiencing mixtures of duty and fascination that transcend easy moral judgment. Chapter 23. The Christianization Shift. New Methods, Same Violence. As Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia from roughly 800 and 1100 CE, execution practices shifted, but perhaps less dramatically than we might expect. New theological frameworks overlaid old practices, changing the meaning of execution without necessarily reducing its frequency or brutality. What changed was less the violence itself, and more how that violence was interpreted, justified, and remembered. The Christianization of Viking execution reveals continuity beneath apparent transformation. Imagine an execution ground in 11th century Norway during the transition period. The old hanging tree still stands at the boundary location where executions have occurred for generations, but now a wooden cross has been erected nearby. The condemned criminal, convicted of murder under laws that predate Christianity but are now being reinterpreted through Christian frameworks, is brought forward. A priest attends, offering last rites that blend Christian prayers with older ritual elements. The execution proceeds by hanging, the traditional method, but now framed as sending the criminal's soul to Christian judgment, rather than to Odin's realm, or wherever pagans believed executed criminals went. Same tree, same rope, same death, but new theological meaning. What made the Christian transition particularly interesting was how it added layers of punishment rather than simply replacing old practices. Pre-Christian Vikings worried about Draugr, the physical return of improperly buried dead. Christian Vikings added concern for the soul's eternal fate. An executed criminal now faced not just physical death and dishonoured burial, but eternal damnation. The body might be denied proper burial, and the soul might be denied salvation. Execution under Christian frameworks theoretically combined temporal punishment with eternal consequences, making it even more severe in theological terms even if the physical methods remained largely unchanged. The execution methods themselves showed both continuity and change. Hanging remained common, perhaps even became more common as it aligned with biblical execution precedents. Beheading continued for high-status criminals. Drowning persisted, now sometimes framed through Christian baptism imagery, inverted into death rather than salvation. What declined were the explicitly pagan ritual elements, the sacrificial aspects of blot executions, the dedication of victims to specific Norse gods. But the violence itself, the practical mechanics of killing, continued much as before. Christianity changed the mythology around execution more than the methodology. The saga literature from the Christian period reflects this blend. Stories written down by Christian authors in the 13th century, describing events from the pagan period, show clear Christian reinterpretation. Pagan executions are described in Christian moral terms. Victims sometimes convert and receive baptism before death. Unlikely historical detail, but meaningful to Christian authors who wanted to show mercy even in execution. The sagas preserve older execution traditions but filter them through Christian sensibilities, giving us texts that reflect multiple layers of cultural transition rather than clean before and after snapshots. Archaeological evidence from Christian period execution sites shows this continuity. Execution grounds continued to be used in the same locations, even as Christianity became established. The boundary placements, the lack of proper burial, the face-down body positioning, all these continued under Christian rule. What changed was sometimes the presence of crosses or Christian symbols at execution sites, and occasionally the direction bodies faced, toward Jerusalem rather than according to pagan orientation beliefs. But the basic pattern of executing criminals at boundary locations and denying them normal burial remained consistent across the religious transition. This reminds us that religious change often transforms meanings while preserving practices. Christianity gave Vikings new frameworks for understanding execution, sin and salvation, eternal punishment, divine judgment, but didn't necessarily reduce the actual violence communities inflicted on criminals. So the next time you think of Christianization as somehow civilizing Viking violence, remember that Christian Vikings still hanged, beheaded, drowned, and exposed criminals to death. They simply did so in Christ's name rather than Odin's, making the same violence serve new theological purposes while maintaining its social function of removing criminals and reinforcing community boundaries. Chapter 24. Archaeological Evidence. What bones tell us. Let us become forensic scientists for a moment, examining what archaeological evidence actually reveals about Viking execution. Bones tell stories that saga literature cannot. Stories of where blades struck, how many times, whether victims tried to defend themselves, whether death came quickly or slowly. Modern forensic techniques allow us to reconstruct final moments with uncomfortable precision, transforming abstract, historical execution into specific individual trauma we can almost witness through the evidence bodies preserve. Picture a specialist analysing skeletal remains from a Viking Age execution site. The skull shows a sharp force trauma on the left parietal bone, a blade strike that fractured but didn't penetrate the skull fully. The cervical vertebrae bear multiple cut marks at odd angles on C3, C4 and C-file, clear evidence that beheading required multiple strikes, with at least one attempt cutting only partially through before the executioner adjusted and struck again. The left radius and ulna show defensive wounds where the victim raised their arm instinctively, the blade cutting through flesh and striking bone before reaching the intended neck target. This skeleton tells a story of an execution that went poorly, of a condemned person who saw the blade coming and tried to protect themselves, of an executioner who needed 3 or 4 strikes to separate head from body. What made archaeological analysis truly revelatory was its specificity. We can determine handedness. Blade angles sometimes reveal whether the executioner was right or left-handed. We can sequence wounds. Bone trauma analysis shows which cuts happened first based on fracture patterns and how bones responded to impact. We can determine perimortem versus postmortem trauma. Injuries occurring at death show different bone characteristics than damage occurring after death, allowing researchers to distinguish execution wounds from later damage or ritual mutilation. We can even sometimes extract isotope data revealing where victims grew up, what they ate, whether they were local or foreign. The Ridgeway Hill mass grave provides perhaps the most detailed forensic reconstruction of Viking Age execution. 54 young men, all decapitated, buried together around 1000 CE in Dorset, England. They were likely Viking raiders captured and executed by Saxons. Detailed osteological analysis revealed their story. Most were Scandinavian based on isotope analysis, aged roughly 15 to 25, showing evidence of lives involving physical labour and violence. The execution itself was systematic but messy. Some received single clean strikes separating head from body. Others showed evidence of multiple cut marks suggesting repeated attempts. Several skeletons bore defensive wounds on arms and hands. One individual was kneeling when struck, others standing. The grave contained bodies thrown in without ceremony, heads tossed in separately with no attempt to match them to correct bodies. Other sites tell different stories. A Swedish execution ground revealed a woman buried face down with stones on her back. Clear attempt to prevent her rising as Draugr. Her vertebrae showed no blade marks, but her hyoid bone was fractured. Evidence of strangulation or hanging. Bog bodies preserve different evidence. Soft tissue survival allows analysis of ligature marks, stomach contents revealing last meals, skin showing, tattoos or scars or other personal details. Each site, each skeleton, each preserved body adds specificity to our understanding, transforming Viking execution from abstract historical concept into collection of individual deaths we can reconstruct with scientific precision. The technology continues improving. DNA analysis might soon allow reconstruction of family relationships, where executed criminals buried together related. Facial reconstruction brings bog bodies back to visual life, showing us faces of people dead 2,000 years. Advanced imaging reveals injuries invisible to naked eye examination. Each technological advance gives us new ways to understand Viking execution, new details to make these deaths feel more immediate and real. This reminds us that archaeology performs a kind of necromancy, not raising the dead, but making them speak across vast time through their physical remains. Viking execution victims cannot tell us their names, their crimes, their final thoughts, but their bones reveal where they were struck, how many times, whether death came quickly. Their preserved skin shows rope marks. Their stomach contents reveal last meals. So the next time you encounter Viking execution in abstract historical terms, remember the Ridgeway Hill skeletons with their multiple blade marks. Remember the bog bodies with leather cords still around their necks. Remember that forensic science gives us uncomfortable intimacy with deaths we might prefer to keep safely distant in time and abstraction. Chapter 25. Modern Misunderstandings and Viking Brutality Myths. We arrive now at the end of our examination and must address the question that has perhaps lurked throughout. Why do we get Viking execution so wrong? Why does popular culture obsess over the blood eagle while ignoring the common hanging? Why do we imagine Vikings as uniquely brutal executioners when archaeological evidence suggests their capital punishment was comparable to, or even less frequent than, other medieval societies? What do our misconceptions about Viking execution reveal about us rather than about them? Imagine the typical depiction of Viking execution in modern media. There is elaborate ritual, theatrical violence, possibly the blood eagle or some other invented torture method. The execution is savage, creative, brutal in ways designed to shock modern audiences. Vikings are portrayed as uniquely violent, as if they invented new forms of killing that other cultures couldn't imagine. And this portrayal, compelling as it may be for drama, fundamentally misrepresents the historical reality. Most Viking executions were hanging. Simple, practical, unglamorous hanging. The most common execution method was also the most boring, and that boring truth doesn't serve the narrative function that Viking brutality myths fulfill. What made these misunderstandings particularly revealing was their consistency across popular culture. The blood eagle appears in television shows, novels, video games, everywhere except reliable historical evidence. Scholars have written extensively about its anatomical impossibility, its likely origin as poetic metaphor rather than literal practice, its appearance in only a handful of saga passages that may have been misinterpreted. Yet the myth persists because it serves a purpose. It makes Vikings the ultimate barbarians, allows us to indulge in imagined violence while maintaining moral distance through historical and cultural remove, provides dramatic set pieces for entertainment media. The truth, that Vikings mostly just hanged people like everyone else, doesn't serve these purposes. The archaeological evidence directly contradicts the brutality myths. Comparative analysis of execution frequency shows that Viking Age Scandinavia had relatively rare capital punishment compared to many medieval societies. The elaborate legal frameworks of thing assemblies, the possibility of compensation payments instead of execution, the careful distinction between different levels of crime, all suggest a society that used execution sparingly, as last resort rather than routine response. This doesn't mean Viking society was gentle or non-violent, but it means the specific violence of legal execution was not as frequent or as theatrically brutal as popular culture suggests. The saga literature itself has been misread and overinterpreted. Sagas were entertainment literature written generations after the events they describe, by Christian authors looking back at pagan ancestors. They exaggerated for drama. They included poetic language not meant literally. They emphasise memorable, exceptional cases rather than mundane, typical ones. Treating saga descriptions as forensic historical accounts leads to misunderstanding. The blood eagle references are poetic. The emphasis on dramatic executions reflects narrative necessity rather than statistical frequency. The omission of boring routine hangings makes literary sense even though hanging was the actual common method. Perhaps most importantly, we project our own anxieties about violence onto historical Vikings. We want them to be more brutal than us, want their violence to be theatrical and excessive, because this allows us to feel civilized by comparison. Never mind that modern societies practice violence on scales Vikings couldn't imagine. Industrialized warfare, mechanized execution, violence embedded in systems so large they become invisible. We focus on individual Viking brutality to avoid confronting our own collective violence. The boring historical truth is that Vikings killed criminals much like other medieval societies, used methods that were practical rather than theatrical, and probably executed people less frequently than many contemporary cultures. But this truth doesn't serve our psychological need for barbarian others who make us feel civilized. So as we conclude this examination of Viking execution, let us remember what evidence actually shows. Hanging was most common, beheading for higher status criminals, drowning in bogs, wells and ocean, rarely burning or elaborate methods. Execution was legally regulated, required thing assembly approval for free people, and happened within frameworks that emphasise compensation over capital punishment when possible. Vikings were violent, certainly, but their specific execution practices were neither uniquely brutal nor particularly theatrical compared to other medieval societies. What makes Viking execution interesting is not exotic brutality, but rather its ordinariness, its reminder that humans across all cultures have struggled with questions of justice, punishment, and the awful necessity of sometimes deciding that certain people must die. The next time you encounter Vikings in popular culture, watch for the execution myths. Notice the blood eagle's appearance, recognise the exaggeration, and remember that the real history, the boring history, is more interesting precisely because it's more human, more ordinary, more revealing of actual people trying to create legal systems that maintained order while acknowledging the terrible cost of taking life even legally. Viking execution was mostly just hanging, and that boring truth matters more than all the dramatic myths we've constructed around it. And so we arrive at the end of our examination of Viking execution methods. We've journeyed through 25 chapters exploring how Vikings actually killed criminals condemned by their legal systems. Not the theatrical blood eagles of popular imagination, but the mundane reality of hanging, beheading, drowning, and occasional burning. We've seen how execution was legally regulated through thing assemblies, how methods varied by social status and gender, how bodies were treated after death to prevent spiritual contamination. We've examined the role of executioners living as social outcasts, the evidence preserved in bog bodies and execution ground burials, the gradual shift as Christianity overlaid new meanings onto old practices. The pattern that emerges is neither savage barbarism nor peculiar creativity and violence. Instead, we find a society that developed sophisticated legal frameworks for managing capital punishment, that used execution sparingly compared to many contemporary cultures, that struggled with the moral burden of illegal killing just as societies do today. Vikings created systems for distributing responsibility across communities through required witness, for maintaining honour hierarchies even in death, for protecting themselves from spiritual dangers associated with execution. They were neither more nor less violent than other medieval peoples. They were simply human, working within their cultural frameworks to balance justice against mercy, social order against individual rights, practical necessity against moral cost. What we've really been examining, beneath all the specific details about ropes and swords and bogs, is how humans construct systems of legitimate violence. Every society that practices capital punishment must answer certain questions. Who decides who dies? What crimes merit death? How should execution be carried out? What happens to bodies afterward? Who performs the actual killing? And what are the social consequences for executioners? Vikings answered these questions differently than we do, but the questions themselves remain constant across time and culture. In that sense, studying Viking execution reveals not exotic otherness, but uncomfortable similarity. They struggled with capital punishment's moral weight, just as modern societies continue to struggle. Perhaps most revealing has been examining our own misunderstandings about Viking execution. The persistence of blood eagle myths despite scholarly debunking, the emphasis on rare, elaborate methods over common, simple ones, the desire to imagine Vikings as uniquely brutal. All this tells us that we need barbarian others against whom to measure our own civilization. We want Vikings to be more violent than us because it makes our own violence seem moderate by comparison. But the archaeological evidence denies us this comfort. Vikings executed criminals much like everyone else, using practical methods, within legal frameworks, struggling with the same moral questions that persist today. But of course, there's more to say about how this history connects to our present moment, how understanding Viking execution might inform contemporary debates about capital punishment. The questions Vikings grappled with remain disturbingly current. Consider, modern societies that practice capital punishment still debate appropriate methods: lethal injection designed to appear medical and humane, or electric chair or firing squad, or hanging in some jurisdictions. Vikings chose hanging, beheading, drowning. The methods differ, but the underlying concern is the same. How do we kill in ways that satisfy both practical necessity and moral sensibility? How do we manage execution's violence to make it acceptable to the community that authorises it? Vikings distributed moral responsibility by requiring communal witness at thing assemblies. Modern societies distribute responsibility differently, through juries, appellate systems, multiple layers of review, witnesses at executions limited to selected few, rather than entire communities. But the principle remains: no single person should bear sole responsibility for legal killing. We spread the guilt as thinly as possible across multiple people and institutions, just as Vikings spread it across all who attended thing assemblies and witnessed executions. Vikings struggled with who should perform executions, creating a class of polluted executioners who lived as social outcasts despite performing necessary work. Modern societies struggle similarly. Executioners often report psychological trauma, difficulty reconciling their role with their values, isolation from communities that simultaneously demand their services and judge them for providing it. We've professionalised and hidden the executioner role, but we haven't resolved the fundamental paradox that Vikings confronted. Someone must kill for the state, yet killing marks the killer as different, damaged, polluted in ways hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. The archaeological evidence of Viking execution, the face-down burials, the denial of proper rites, the stones pinning corpses to earth, reminds us that violence doesn't end when hearts stop beating. Modern death penalty debates similarly wrestle with questions about body disposal, whether executed criminals deserve burial with full honours, how execution affects not just the condemned but their families and communities. Vikings were explicit about their belief that some dead were dangerous and required special containment. We've secularised these concerns into psychological and social terms, but the underlying anxiety persists. What do we do with bodies of people we've killed legally? Perhaps the most uncomfortable parallel is how both Viking and modern societies create moral distance from execution. Vikings used passive methods like exposure. Nature kills, not us. They use boundary locations. The killing happens at the edge, not in the community centre. They used ritual pollution concepts. The executioner absorbs the moral cost, not the community. Modern societies create similar distances. Execution happens in prisons far from public view, performed by designated specialists, witnessed by limited few, described in clinical medical language rather than acknowledging its violence. The mechanisms differ, but the impulse toward moral distancing remains constant. But these modern parallels, while thought-provoking, perhaps risk treating Viking execution too instrumentally, as a mere prelude to contemporary debates. There's something else worth considering about the human relationship with institutionalised violence across time. Before we conclude entirely, I want to thank you for staying with me through this lengthy examination. 3 hours or more of discussion about execution methods is not light material, and yet here you are still listening. Whether you've used this video as intended sleep aid and drifted off somewhere around chapter 12, or whether you've stayed alert through all 25 chapters and are hearing these words with full consciousness, thank you for the time you've given to this exploration. These deep dives into unglamorous historical topics serve multiple purposes. Yes, they're designed to be sleep-friendly. The methodical pacing, the repetitive structure, the gentle narrator voice, all calibrated to ease listeners toward rest. But they're also genuine historical inquiry, attempts to understand past societies on their own terms rather than through modern assumptions, and their explorations of human nature itself, how we create systems of violence, how we justify killing, how we distribute moral responsibility, how we remember and misremember our own histories. If you found this examination valuable, whether as sleep aid, educational content, or simply as company during quiet hours, I hope you'll return for future videos. The channel has dozens of these lengthy historical explorations already available, and more topics are always in development. From Viking tavern conditions to medieval plague survival to gladiator reality versus myth. We examine the boring, unglamorous, often disturbing details that popular culture overlooks. The subscribe button and notification bell are there if you want to be alerted to new videos, and as always, comments are welcome. Corrections, suggestions, thoughts, or simply greetings from wherever in the world you're listening. But there's one more element worth reflecting on before we part ways for this evening. Picture, one final time, a Viking execution ground at dusk. The summer sun hangs low on the northern horizon, casting long shadows across the boundary space where executions occur. The hanging tree stands silhouetted against pale sky. Perhaps there are stones marking graves of those executed years before, their names forgotten, but their presence still felt in this liminal space between settlement and wilderness. The last witnesses have departed. The executioner has returned to his isolated dwelling across the stream, and the newest body hangs silent, witnessed now only by ravens in the long northern twilight. This image stays with me as we conclude, not because it's particularly dramatic or violent, but because it's so ordinary. Somewhere in Viking Age Scandinavia, on hundreds or perhaps thousands of occasions across 3 centuries, this scene repeated itself. A person died by communal legal decision, witnessed by their community, their body left as warning and their spirit consigned to whatever afterlife Vikings believed awaited executed criminals. And then life continued. Children played, farmers planted, traders negotiated. The dead person became memory, then story, then eventually forgotten entirely, except as anonymous archaeological evidence discovered centuries later by researchers trying to reconstruct what actually happened. History is built from countless such moments. Ordinary violence, routine deaths, boring repetitions of procedures that seem necessary at the time, but now appear barbaric, or at least strange. The Vikings who watched executions at Thing assemblies weren't monsters. They were people trying to maintain social order in societies without professional law enforcement, trying to balance mercy against justice, trying to protect their communities while wrestling with the moral weight of legal killing. They got many things wrong by our standards, but they were trying, working within their cultural frameworks to create systems that made sense to them, even if they don't make sense to us. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of these 3 hours examining Viking execution. Humans across all times and cultures struggle with the same fundamental questions about justice, violence, punishment, and death. We construct different answers, develop different practices, create different moral frameworks. But the questions persist. When does someone deserve to die? Who should decide? How should it be done? What do we do with the bodies? How do we live with having killed legally? These are not questions Vikings solved and we've transcended. These are permanent human questions that every generation must wrestle with anew. For now, though, let these thoughts drift away. Let the Viking execution grounds fade into the northern twilight. Let the details of hanging and beheading and drowning recede into the general haze of historical knowledge, filed away for future reference or forgotten entirely. If you're using this video as sleep aid, I hope you found the steady rhythm of chapters and the methodical exploration conducive to rest. If you've stayed alert throughout, I hope you found the examination interesting and perhaps thought-provoking. Sleep well, dear listener, wherever you are. Let the distant past stay comfortably distant. Let the questions about violence and justice wait for another day when you're rested and ready to confront them. For now, there's only the quiet of late evening or early morning, the comfort of your bed or chair, the simple animal need for rest that transcends history and culture, and all the complicated questions humans create for themselves. Thank you for spending these hours with me in the unglamorous corners of history. Until next time, I wish you peaceful sleep, interesting dreams, and the comfort of knowing that while humans have always struggled with difficult questions about how to live together, we've also always somehow managed to wake up the next day and try again. The Vikings did, we do, and that persistence, that stubborn human determination to keep trying despite all our failures and violence and complicated moral tangles, may be the most boring and most remarkable historical truth of all. Good night, dear listener, or good morning, or good afternoon. Whenever and wherever you are, may you rest well.